Thank you. I'm not going to distract you with PowerPoint or any other kind of technical wizardry. I'm just going to talk. Ivan introduced our discussions with Allison's 2017 book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? And remarks on the ways in which Thucydides has been invoked in connection with the problems of our own time, a time characterized by Hobsbawm in a 1994 book as Age of Extremes, the short 20th century, 1914 to 1991. So we've been invited to consider the uses to which Thucydides has recently been put and to play our part in doing justice to it. Luca continued by outlining the scheme of the video session and looking forward to a published volume which will include not only the contributions made in the video session today, but also a range of further papers. We began with Timothy Rood on Thucydides' archaeology in the early 20th century, explored through the work of Zimmern, who started his career as a tutor in ancient history at Oxford, but subsequently became a professor of international relations, first at Aberystwyth and afterwards at Oxford. Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth in 1911 began with geography and climate, and then in separate sections it continued with the political and with the economic development of Greece, invoking particularly the archaeology in Book 1 and Pericles' funeral oration in Book 2. Zimmern was one of those who wanted to broaden the scope of ancient history at Oxford, on which I might remark that in the early 1960s, when I encountered it, although some lecturers were attempting various kinds of broadening, the formal syllabus hadn't yet been broadened at all. And Zimmern saw the germ of various social sciences in Thucydides. What he gave us, I think, was a reading of Thucydides against the grain, emphasizing those insights of other kinds to be found particularly, though not only, in the archaeology, rather than the narrative of political decisions, marches, and battles, which occupies most of Thucydides' history. Francis Laurent turned to one part of that narrative, the account in books 6 and 7 of Athens' Sicilian expedition of 415 to 430. He notes the abandonment of the older view of Thucydides as an authoritative reporter of facts, to be replaced by a biased Thucydides who wanted to portray a particular point of view, or a literary writer who imposed literary patterns on his history, or a thinker interested in multiple contextualization and in aporiae to be debated. Laurent sees four kinds of recent interpretation of the Sicilian expedition: a self-standing episode, peripheral to the main war between Athens and Sparta, or a major turning point in the Peloponnesian War, and indeed in Athenian history and in the 5th century as a whole, or the ultimate achievement in Greek history, as in Thucydides 787. We return to this view of the expedition in Manuela del Borgo's paper. Or finally, a striking instance of military disaster, paradigmatic for all time. Laurent welcomes this plurality of responses, which fits a more critical approach to Thucydides and what he sees as the aporetic nature of Thucydides' history. And he opens that Thucydides was open to multiple interpretations at the time, just as he is now. In a pair of papers on Anglophone scholarship, Benjamin Early looks at Christian pacifist readings of Thucydides in and after the First World War. While some people from Hobbes onwards favored the idea that Thucydides educates us about war so that we may live in peace, people such as Glover in Britain and Cochrane in Canada thought that Thucydides identified the problem but didn't see how it might be resolved. Glover, in From Pericles to Philip, tried to reconcile his pacifism with his fear of German expansionism. Athens, after defeating the Persians, had failed to give Greece the right kind of leadership, as Britain in Glover's time had failed to give Europe the right kind of leadership. And in Thucydides, he saw an emphasis on the misfortunes which accompanied war. Cochrane, in Thucydides and the Science of History, argued that Thucydides, influenced by Ionian philosophy, investigated the causes of human events, including war, as the Hippocratics had investigated the causes of disease. The study of man had not shown how human passions could be reined in and war could be prevented. That needed a religious and moral dimension which was absent from Thucydides. Whatever the solution, Early thinks that we should take note of Thucydides' pessimism. Ivan Matijasic turned to Powell, who played an active part in the Second World War and therefore never actually occupied the chair of Greek at Durham to which he'd been appointed before the war, and who, as Early reminded us, had called Cochrane's book the very worst book ever written on Thucydides. Powell gave a lecture to the Classical Association in 1936 on the war, that is the First World War, and its aftermath, in their influence upon Thucydidean studies. In that, he already foresaw a Second World War and wanted to see the First War and the Second as a single conflict, culminating in the historically inevitable self-defense and fall of the British Empire, as Thucydides had seen a single Peloponnesian War and fall of the Athenian Empire from 431 to 404. Powell deplored not only pacifist readings such as that of Cochrane, but also the enlistment of Greece and Rome by the fascists to supply support for their policies. On international relations, Powell was a realist before the realist school had come into existence. And from the past, he drew the pessimistic lesson that study of the pitfalls into which contemporaries have fallen, of the blind alleys up which they have been led, may have a very real value for ourselves. We turned then from the Anglophone world to 20th century Italy. Dino Piovani focused on De Sanctis, who refused to swear the oath of allegiance in 1931, and his pupils. De Sanctis was himself a pupil of Baylock, but he combined with Baylock's influence his own Catholicism and Croce's view of history as contemporary history. In particular, the question of what parts of Thucydides' history were written when became for him a matter of tracing Thucydides' intellectual development, with the Melian dialogue in Book 5, written after the end of the war, to serve as a condemnation of Athens' treatment of Milos and of its imperialism in general. Ferrabino, in L'Impero Ateniese, in line with fascist ideas, was opposed to democracy and to the Athenian Empire, and he criticized Athens for failing to achieve the unity of the Greek people. He saw Thucydides as an authoritative reporter and a realist on international relations. Momigliano, even more than De Sanctis, focused on development. Thucydides' development and subsequent development by the standards of which Thucydides was not yet an expert in the use of documents or in ability to formulate historical problems. Luca Iori introduced us to an overt use of Thucydides to counter fascism, a selection of translated passages from Book 3 on civil war and Book 8 on Athens' oligarchic revolution of 411, entitled Thucydides Il Fascismo, and published in 1924 in Gorbetti's Turin magazine La Rivoluzione Liberale. Articles about earlier history and historians could escape censorship, as articles overtly about the current situation couldn't, and this was one of several such articles. The passages were rearranged to support an argument. Each of them was given a provocative title. The first from Book 8 was The March on Rome and the Saviours of the Fatherland. The translations weren't inaccurate, but they were slanted by the omission of Athenian details, which would weaken the analogy, and by the use of more emphatic language than that of Thucydides. Iori suggests that this use of Thucydides was due not merely to a desire to circumvent the censors, but also to a genuine belief that Thucydides and Sallust and Machiavelli did hold liberal views. Thucydides was seen as genuinely opposed to the use of violence for particular political objectives. And it was at Turin that De Sanctis was professor and represented Thucydides as a supporter of Periclean democracy. So this movement enlisted the classics against the fascists' own enlistment of classical Rome. We next had papers on international relations. Hans Kopp dealt with Frisch, a Danish classicist and politician. Frisch published in 1939 a major essay on ideology and reality in Thucydides, remarking that recent events hadn't diminished the value of reading Thucydides. That study, Kopp says, is almost devoid of topical remarks, but in discussing the Melian dialogue, Frisch claims that that was written to show that in the face of Athens' overwhelming strength, Milos' opposition was futile, and the dialogue should become required readings in the schools of all small nations. Milos' hope for support from Sparta was touchingly naive, as Denmark's hope for support from Britain had been shown to be unrealistic in 1937. A paper on a piece of classical geopolitics in Sozialisten in 1940 was a comment on current world politics from the perspective of the socialist intellectual, arguing that Athens' attack on Milos and the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland in 1939 were both to be understood in terms of materialism and geopolitics. In 1944, in Classical Thoughts in a Hard Time, one of the essays collected in Frisch's Thinking and Speaking in Wartime, he gave an account of the civil war in Corcyra as an episode of universal relevance, presented as a New Year greeting from Thucydides' workshop to young workers in Denmark. Overall, Frisch wrote as a citizen of a small state who thought that heroic resistance to large states was doomed to failure, and who used Thucydides to support that view. Elizabeth Sawyer took us back to Zimmern, and this time to his translation of Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides too. To explain why things happened, Thucydides needed to indicate the emotions of the people involved. In incorporating speeches, he invited readers to feel along with the ancient audience, and his speeches and modern translations of them required emotional power. Zimmern translated the funeral oration in the Greek Commonwealth. This is more concrete and dramatic than other versions of it, and it had a remarkable afterlife. One of Zimmern's pupils sent that book and a translation of Thucydides to Churchill in 1915. Livingstone incorporated Zimmern's version in his 1943 abridged translation of Thucydides, produced with an eye to the Second World War. One of those who read that was the influential American L.J. Haller, if that's how he's pronounced, author of the 1955 book Civilization and Foreign Policy. And from there, it found its way into Bartlett's familiar quotations to be used in speeches by a variety of American politicians. And I can add that it was largely from Zimmern's translation of the funeral oration that excerpts were displayed on London buses in the First World War. Finally, Manuela Dal Borgo gives us a different kind of reception. This wasn't included in the YouTube talks. In Thucydides and Game Theory, she starts from a passage in Pericles' speech in Book 1 to argue that Thucydides was not simply giving a historical record or rhetorically constructing a speech in which Pericles responded to speeches in Sparta, but setting out a view of the agone between Athens and Sparta to provide a framework for the narrative of the war as a whole. In 141:7, Pericles says of the Peloponnesians that each one thinks that no harm will result from neglect of their common interests on his own part, but it is the responsibility of somebody else to take some forethought for him, so that as the same notion is held separately by all, it escapes notice that the common interest is being destroyed collectively. And observations such as this make Thucydides the father of game theory. Free riders succeed only if others still support the common interest while they don't. As in the prisoner's dilemma, those who expect others to act selfishly will themselves act selfishly, and so they will produce a tragedy of the commons. At various points in Thucydides, selfishness or pessimism among individual members of a group produces a self-fulfilling selfishness or pessimism in the group as a whole. And game theory helps us to identify critical turning points beyond which a failure becomes inevitable. Where does this take us? Different meanings in ancient texts are seen in different contexts. That's natural and it's acceptable. And it's that variety which makes reception an interesting field for study. The willingness of the ancient Greeks to engage in substantial refashioning of their stories about what they believed to be their past shows that that possibility is one to which they themselves were open. Thucydides wasn't an enthusiast for democracy, but he believed in right conduct, both by individuals and by communities. And so it's not surprising that we find him enlisted in Italy in the 1920s by opponents of the fascists, who, when they couldn't address contemporary events directly, could hint at them by writing about the past. Frisch in Denmark in the 1930s and 1940s pessimistically read the Melian Dialogue as a demonstration that small states caught up in wars between the great powers should seek a means of survival rather than heroic suicide. He saw 5th century Athens, like the contemporary Soviet Union, as driven by geopolitical forces, and he found a universal relevance in the account of degradation, which Thucydides based on civil war in Corcyra. In the Anglophone world, Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth mined Thucydides for information on the background to the political and military events on which most of his narrative was focused, and included a rhetorically effective translation of Pericles' funeral oration, whose effects spread from London buses in the First World War to the armory of quotations of American politicians after the Second. And while Italian opponents of fascism had presented Thucydides as a writer on their side, Glover in Britain and Cochrane in Canada lamented that 5th century Greece had not found how to achieve a peaceful interstate order. And Powell, with a different kind of pessimism, looked at the First World War and the coming Second World War and the fall of the British Empire. Ivan Matijasic, in his introduction, mentioned a recent invocation of Thucydides, Thucydides' trap, by which a new great power rises to challenge an established great power, and so there is the threat of war, as when Thucydides gave us the truest reason for the Peloponnesian War, that the Athenians, by becoming great and inspiring fear in the Spartans, forced them to go to war, and China is now challenging the USA. I recently had to write an introduction to a Chinese translation of my Bloomsbury book on Thucydides, and I was advised not to mention Thucydides' trap. Our contributors have focused almost entirely on the first half of the 20th century and on the deployment of Thucydides for further purposes. That means that we have not attended much to another aspect of the reception of Thucydides, the change since the middle of the 20th century from the paragon of objectivity and accuracy of the later 19th and early 20th century to the artful reporter who, in what different scholars see as different ways and for different purposes, led his readers to see as he wanted a history which could have been seen in other ways. The Thucydides whom we read nowadays is a far more slippery writer than the Thucydides whom our predecessors read. I have no time to go into that in detail today, but this changed attitude to how we read Thucydides has implications for how we might deploy him for our own further purposes. Ivan ended his introduction by remarking that contextualizing Thucydides' interpretations, especially the most daring and questionable ones, albeit often quite fortunate, is perhaps the only way not only to grasp Thucydides' authentic message, but also his legacy in an ever-changing world that seeks reliable voices from the past to interpret the present. Although we may indeed make of Thucydides what we wish, as classicists we need at least to start by contextualizing his interpretations, by doing our best to work out his authentic message, that is, what his history would have meant to him and to his first readers. That isn't as easy a task as it seemed a century ago, and the results which we shall reach will be less certain, but it's all the more necessary. And if we are to deploy Thucydides for our own purposes in the circumstances of our own world, we must, in fairness to him, be careful and honest in trying to work out what he was saying about his world. If we don't do that, we may surpass Cochrane in producing the worst books ever written on Thucydides. Thank you.